So my name is Montana Burgess. I use she or they pronouns. I run Neighbors United. I'm actually not a founder. It's been around for 30 years this year, and I didn't start it when I was 10. So I've been at the organization for 10 years, though, and we went through a name change and rebrand and all sorts of good stuff since I've been there. I'm based on the unceded lands of the Sinixt peoples, who are not extinct, despite what our federal government says, also known as the West Kootenays. But I didn't always live here. I grew up in Kamloops. Who's been to Kamloops? Put up your hand. Yeah, Kamloops is hot and dry. I grew up there in the early 90s, and there was rattlesnakes, cactus. They're still there. That hasn't changed. And I did not love that climate. I am not a hot person, like not a hot weather person. I prefer the cold. So it never really worked for me, which is one of the reasons 12 years ago that I moved to the Kootenays. And when I first moved here, it looked like this. This is a picture from Castlegar. Sorry if it's blurry. I don't know what's going on here. But it's a inland temperate rainforest, or snow forest is a more accurate description. It's lush. There is not rattlesnakes and cactus. There is things like cedar and ferns everywhere. But since I've lived here, it's changed. Most summers are now like this, and actually even more like this for like 6 weeks. And when I was growing up in Kamloops, it's a place that's meant to burn. The forests there need to burn so the grasslands can rule. And when I was a kid, there was only a handful of days where it was too smoky that I couldn't play outside, and the sun was like that yellowish, orangish, pinkish color. And all this it's not pleasant. It doesn't make me feel good, but I can cope with it. I can do it. But then it all changed for me when my child, Bearstow, was born. She's now 6 years old. And on the day before Halloween, when she was 2, she had a cold and she was really struggling to breathe. I called the nurse's hotline after a while when I was putting her to bed, and she wouldn't go down, and her breathing was so shallow and fast, and described what was going on. They said, "Sounds concerning, call 911. So I did, and I lived in a rural area at this time. And while I was waiting for the ambulance to come, I was terrified and felt hopeless and helpless as a parent, that I couldn't provide the most basic thing you're supposed to as a parent, which is safety for my child. Anyways, the ambulance came, and here's a picture from the hospital. We got her on oxygen and all the things, and it turns out she has asthma. So she's generally fine. She has her inhaler that she uses, and it keeps it under control when she's sick or when she overexerts herself. But when this happens, I'm terrified of letting her go outside. Last year in July, before it was even super smoky, there was that tragic death in 100 Mile with that 9-year-old kid who had asthma before it was even smoky, very smoky, and had an asthma attack and died from it. And I'm terrified that'll happen to my baby. So the reasons we all are in this struggle are different, and mine have changed over time, but this is why I'm in it right now, because literally my child's life depends on having clean air to breathe, being asthmatic. And right now in the interior of BC, that is not a given. It's not safe. And we're so privileged and lucky that we have the resources to have an air purifier and to keep her home from school or daycare when it's too smoky, to make sure she's safe. And not everyone has that. So I want to make sure in this fight that we're looking out for the kids like her. So the work we do at Neighbors United, we're really leaning into, as Patricia said, deep canvassing. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what deep canvassing is, its origins, what it is, what it isn't, and then lean into one of the skills around curiosity, compassionate curiosity, to kind of emphasize, because I think that's what we're doing this afternoon, is talking about compassion. And then leave you with a few key takeaways that you can practice in whatever kind of conversational or communications work you're doing around climate with people in your life. So where does it come from? In 2008 in California, same-sex marriage was once again on the ballot box, as a ballot measure. And polling was looking super good. 40% of people were saying they were going to support marriage equity. And 2008, the election day happens. It's this progressive Obama wave. California is a super progressive state, and they lost. 54% of people had voted against marriage equity, and it was the 28th straight loss on this, and folks were pretty devastated. So the organizers at the LGBT Center in Los Angeles, to their amazing credit, they said, we're doing something wrong. Something isn't working. Let's go talk to people who we think voted against us based on their voting records and find out what's really going on. They're saying in polling they're going to support it, and then on election day they don't. So a small crew of organizers and thousands of volunteers went out and started talking to people that had voted against them. They were visibly queer people, so this is a scary thing. And they were trying to figure out, how can they talk with people who don't agree with them? How can they be honest about who they are and what's going on for them? How can they decrease homophobia and persuade people to support legislation to make sure marriage equity could happen and people were allowed to get married that were same sex, same gender? So this was the birth of deep canvassing. Deep canvassing is an engagement tactic that's transformational instead of transactional, like a more typical traditional canvass. It's rooted in really listening to people and being curious about who they are and what's going on for them, and really holding non-judgment when hearing their concerns to understand the conflict going on inside someone. The canvasser will share their personal life experiences and draw out the same in the person they're canvassing. And by going through this very specific process, the outcome is people change their minds, and that change lasts. So again, put in the chat or raise your hands if you've ever done a traditional canvas, maybe for a political candidate or something like that. Looks like maybe a few. In that context, you're normally trying to get an identification of a voter. Are they yes, are they no, or are they undecided about your candidate or issue? In a deep canvas, we're actually trying to surface their conflicted feelings. So instead of asking like yes or no on something, we're using a 0 to 10 scale to draw out some nuance of how they feel about an issue. In a traditional canvas, canvassers are supposed to just stick to a script. In deep canvassing, canvassers are also supposed to use the script, but the real tool we're trying to cultivate, the real skill we're trying to cultivate in canvassers is being able to listen compassionately and be super curious and find the right lines of questioning to help people get into their lived experience, to help find that story that grounds people in their lived experience. In a traditional canvas, you deliver a message like, will you vote for my candidate? In a deep canvas, the real crux of it is exchanging vulnerable stories to ground people and open them up. So the goal in the deep canvassing method is to move people up to a higher bucket in the scale. So at the beginning, you ask where they stand on an issue. If they say somewhere between 0 to 3, we mark that as unsupportive. If they're 4 to 6, they're undecided. If they're 7 to 10, they're supportive. And at the end of the conversation, we're going to ask them that scale question again, and they'll give themselves a rating. And if they go from like a 3 to a 6, we're calling that moving from unsupportive to undecided. So they're going up the buckets. And that's what we're trying to do, is move people up the buckets. And this is how we measure the impact of persuasion when they move up a bucket. So if someone moves from a 5 to a 6, that's great. We love that, but we're not counting that as a significant persuasion. And so yeah, just when we talk about persuasion rate in deep canvassing, this is what we're talking about, going up these buckets. Deep canvassing has been researched through randomized control trials through some amazing researchers, David Brockman and Joshua Calla out of currently Berkeley and Yale. And in their different experiments, they've found the impact of deep canvassing to be persuasive anywhere, you can see here, between 8% and 20%. And you may be thinking, oh, that's not a lot, but this is like eons more persuasive than any other form of persuasion, like digital tests that have happened. And the interesting part is this persuasion lasts for at least 9 months, maybe longer. It just hasn't been studied longer. So it's the most effective form of persuasion that's been measured. And it's been used, like I said, in the same-sex marriage work, in transgender rights work, abortion, immigration. In the presidential 2020 US race, they did like a Biden versus Trump deep canvass. And over the past 4 years, we've been figuring out how to do it on different environmental issues. So the challenge that we have here in Canada is, and maybe you've seen this slide already today, it's a real sexy one. It's that we have this movable middle, or mushy middle, as I like to call them, where there's 45% of Canadians who are passively concerned. So they know climate change is real, and it's happening, but they're not engaged and their support is unreliable. And so these folks are who I think deep canvassing is perfect to reach, to bring them up to that more alarmed category and try to activate them. So where this came from for us was out of necessity. We were running a campaign where in each of the communities in the West Kootenays where we're based out of, we were trying to get local governments to commit to 100% renewable energy across their community energy use by 2050. 14 of them ended up committing, and we're the largest geographic area that I know of that's committed to this level of ambition in North America. So good job, West Kootenays. And in Trail, we, like Patricia said, it's a heavy industry company town. There's a smelter downtown. The town is literally built around the smelter. And so there's this community that is truly a frontline community that's had these terrible health and safety impacts from the smelter, but they are reliant on the smelter as the center of the economy. So it's truly a jobs versus environment like epicenter. So when we started having conversations with people in the community about, hey, do you support this renewable energy transition? People immediately were like panicked because they're like, but how does this affect the smelter and my livelihood and all those things? So we really quickly ran out of supporters to identify that we were finding using traditional community organizing, which is great and works most of the time in most cases. But we needed to persuade people, we realized, and help them resolve their conflict in order to support this policy, to give the politicians, the local government people, the cover they needed to pass it, to have the support from their community. So I'd heard about deep canvassing, we used it, and we won our campaign. We started doing that work in 2019, and we won on April 25th in 2022. And so how we did that is we figured out the roadmap for success for our particular work. We knew we needed to find a script that worked. And we iterated a script for a year and a half because no one had done this before in climate, and it took a really long time to get it right. We knew we had to develop a training program and recruit a ton of volunteers to have a whole bunch of conversations across the community. And we knew to retain those volunteers and grow even further, we needed to build our team and create a culture that supported and healed canvassers to be able to come back and keep having those often very emotional and challenging conversations. So in deep canvassing, there's a few skills that we need to develop in canvassers to help them have effective conversations consistently. So the first is being able to use the script effectively. The second is being able to tell their personal story in whatever script we're using. It's very specific. In the Trails one, we helped people tell their climate stakes story, and that's what I modeled for you at the beginning of the session, talking about my lived experience and climate impacts and how it personally affected me with my child and my feelings and why I felt that way. The other skill we cultivate is compassionate curiosity. And then gentle assertiveness and something we call the honorable interruption, which I love. So to keep these conversations on track and help the canvassers stay in charge of the conversations. So I wanted to share a little bit more with you today about compassionate curiosity in the theme of compassion. And so the research shows us, and comes from the New Conversation Institute, which is like our mentors, the folks that invented deep canvassing and train on it. And they got together with People's Action to create the Deep Canvas Institute, and they do a bunch of skills training. So this slide comes from them. So the research shows us when we use facts and talking points only, a real traditional tactic of the environmental movement, there's no persuasive impact. People that already agree with us get reinforced in their beliefs, which is great to, motivate the alarmed to keep being alarmed and do things, but it doesn't convince anyone of something. When we share only our personal stories, there's a short-term persuasive impact. But when we're curious about voter stories, and we not only share our stories, but also draw out their lived experience stories, that's where we get the lasting persuasion, that 9 months plus that we can actually work with in like a campaign context. So when we're trying to help people get in their lived experience on an issue, like their lived experience in climate impacts, we really want to go deep. So we can spend all of our energy digging 7 one-foot holes. So asking a few questions here, a few questions there, and never really getting to that treasure chest, that emotional core of what makes them feel emotional about the issue. And sometimes we have to dig a few 1-foot holes here and there to find the right story. But when we start to hit on that story, we want to dig deep and go down to that 1 7-foot hole to find that treasure-filled emotional core of the person. And the main tool we use to do this is something we call the cone of curiosity. And again, like, we didn't invent all of this. We have been refining it in the climate and biodiversity context. This all comes from our friends at the New Conversation Initiative, who really articulated a lot of this work. So the cone of curiosity, I always joke that we should be getting this tattooed on our arms because it's like the most useful thing ever. I've actually made fake temporary tattoos that I encourage our canvassers to wear because I think it's genuinely really helpful to have it right there. But when you hear the hint of a story, like someone's lived experience on climate change, so you're saying, for example, hey, in Heat Dome a couple years ago, like, how was that for you? And so if they start actually sharing a little bit about what was going on, you want to first get them in a very specific moment. So if they're talking about, like, oh yeah, it was really hot, it was terrible, be like, okay, was there a specific time when it was too hot for you to sleep or too hot for you to go outside? And so you'll have to ask a few of those questions for them to be like, oh yeah. And then they'll start to tell you some of those details. Who were they with? What were they doing? Where were they? When was this? So those like journalism, who, what, when, where details. And then once they've kind of grounded you, once you feel like you can picture where they were, that you're in the story with them, then you can ask them, how did that feel? And something we often do is we assume how other people feel because we're projecting like how we feel. So if they say, oh, I felt emotional, emotional is not a feeling. It means they had emotions, but it wasn't a feeling. So then we need to ask, okay, tell me more about that emotional feeling. Was it like sadness? Was it happiness? What was that? And getting them to name their feeling is one of the hardest things, but one of the most core pieces of this work. And once someone names their feeling, then you can say, why did it feel that way? And if they can tell you why it felt that way, and they name that feeling and get you grounded in that experience with them, they are now grounded in their lived experience. They are emotionally open. They have gotten vulnerable with you, and they are now ready to wrestle with their conflict on both sides of the issue, of the policy issue. So this cone of curiosity truly is our fundamental tool in getting people in their lived experience, which allows them to shift in their brains and be able to open up to a new way of looking at something, or being persuaded to look at something from the perspective you're bringing. You can also use deep canvassing principles outside of this very specific structure conversation. You can use the principles in mass communications, in like other more casual conversations and presentations, and you can think about how else you might be able to use them. So we have recommendations for communications in when you're trying to communicate around climate change. If you can find a person, be it you or someone else, who's kind of relatable to your audience, a relatable figure, and the way you make them relatable is share their personal backstory. So you have to acknowledge their identity. Up here in the top right is a guy that we did a story on, Mark Jenner, who worked in the oil sands, lived in this region, the West Kootenays, but was like obsessed with electrifying his house. So an interesting contradiction, but had this like relatable worker background that made him a more trusted messenger than maybe like a university professor, for example, to some audiences. And we really leaned into communicating around his connection to the community and his family. He's born here, he's raised here. He's a guy from the Castlegar area. We then tell the personal climate stake in the communication. So like I told my story of my child, whoever the person is you're telling the story of, get them to name how they observed climate change before and now. So I talked about how it was growing up in Kamloops when I was a kid and how it is now where I live in this more wet place, how they feel about it. And then also if they have any cognitive dissonance, resolve it, get them to name it, resolve it. Like it feels like it's too late, but better late than never. Because a lot of people have those kind of small hangups, and modeling, resolving it can really help. Finally, having your communications be solutions focused is very like motivating for people we've seen. So a specific solution about their community or the person and how they're solving a problem or how they want to solve a problem is helpful in attracting people to be able to like palette the story. One way we do this is through our solutions journalism publication we call Living Here. So it's livinghere.ca. I'll put it in the chat if folks want to subscribe to get those stories as they come out. And then just like a couple final notes. So we have our own campaigns we run. We're running one in Coquitlam with a paid deep canvas team where we are building support for the zero carbon step code, all electric buildings. We're running one in Vernon and Castlegar, and I see some folks I know online who are part of those campaigns. So shout out to our amazing canvassers in Vernon and Castlegar. And in this campaign, we're trying to build support for the biodiversity and ecosystem health law that's proposed for BC to address the terrible ways we continue to manage our forests and put biodiversity and ecosystem health as the key priority. And then we also have a campaign going out in Newfoundland in St. John's, where we are trying to create some cracks in the conversation there around ending offshore oil and gas exploration and getting legislation for that. So that's a longer term campaign, and it's just launched our volunteer program. Then we also train partners. So we have a partner currently in Ohio and in Michigan. And in both of those, we're training them to use deep canvassing to counter in rural areas the pushback against clean energy projects that are being made possible because of the Inflation Reduction Act incentives. And then we've also in the past worked with a group in Maine around a ballot measure last year around public power that they lost, unfortunately. And then we also have worked with the Alberta Environmental Network in their Alberta Talks project, having conversations with suburban Calgarians about ending tax breaks to oil and gas companies. So we're trying to scale this by doing partnerships to train other people to have these conversations and through our own campaigns.